Greetings ladies and gents, and welcome to the batch video for Forgotten Dungeon from the website Royal Road. This video will contain chapters 45 to 49, and as always I hope that you enjoy. Chapter 45. Uno. I really dislike surprises. Surprise visits by friends, surprise birthday parties, surprise boyfriends' day presents. It doesn't matter, my life should be as boring and predictable as possible. Because that's safe. I've sometimes wondered if the quality of mine was part of why I was chosen to work as a dungeon core in this new life. This inner instinct to hide, to burrow, to avoid the other people and their loud, obnoxious attention. Not quite the basement dweller, but close. Now that I started to wonder about the past, it's easy to notice that these memories grow more and more blurry with each passing day. The human in me is getting steadily replaced by a colder, more crystallized persona. Some would even say an inhuman imitation. Not me, though. To live is to learn is to change, and I'm doing just that. Well, not exactly. To tell the truth, I'm currently busying myself with hasty rework of the tunnels and kinda trying to duplicate the current collector. I had not enough knowledge about how it worked, but it was going to need it. Right now. Anima be damned. Meanwhile, my loyal Libras were slowly carrying the now undead Tina to a stretcher. Their target was clear, the central pond room. Of course, before the whole journey started, they were ordered to bind the undead girl with some rope, both for her own and her escort's safety. We knew if she was in the mood to attack my minions, so I wasn't going to risk it. There was no us monsters versus them humans mentality. It was more of free for all in my mind. To make the whole affair harder on Revenant's face was hard to read. Bearing her habit of suddenly screaming and babbling, even the words she did throw out concentrated on revenge and pain, making up a few parts of an endlessly repeating mantra. I once saw something like that in reality, when a bully guy in my class muttered endlessly, working himself into a rabbit cage to beat on his oppressors. He was expelled, by the way. His bullies were not. I sure hope it won't happen again. No matter, back to work. Discarding idle thoughts, I focused on remaking the ceilings between the first and second floor. More precisely, the tunnels with the staircase were starting up behind the Guardian's room and then leading the whole way down, right into the central pond. It was only by 10 or 20 meters, but the trouble it brought me. At least the whole shape of the spiral with steps curved in the rock instead of something built with a brick and mortar. Because of that, I managed to carve a ditch in the middle of the ceiling, deep enough to slip my copper wires through it. This action only added a few more meters to the already gigantic network. I guess it's kinda similar to a human nervous system. The one I saw on TV, at least. The feeler wires are stretching everywhere and connecting all the important parts of my body. The dungeon itself. Now came the hard part. Like I mentioned before, what I wanted was something akin to a current collector. What is that exactly? A mobile device used on a tram to attach to the power lines. In my case, I had an idea to interconnect it with clusters of wires already attached to the Guardian's head and allow him a greater mobility. It didn't escape me that the current collector, as its name described, wasn't made to transfer information or mana. But it had to do. The anima would fix something similar enough. I could also go the other way, just extend the wiring and make it more mobile this way. In a normal situation, this would have even been preferable. I had to just make sure that he kept his spare wire somewhere safe. It was the somewhere safe that I was worried about. Currently, my first floor was teeming with soldier patrols. They were checking every nook and cranny, while constantly staring at my already spawned floor boss. I was paranoid that they would go after an attack of opportunity as soon as they saw that the Guardian was absent. My options were limited, so instead of useless thoughts I just worked, shaping stone and copper into an imitation, leaving the anima to connect the pieces. All the while the Guardian tried desperately to converse with me. "My lord," he whispered mentally, these unstable and frightful thoughts freely flowing through my mind. "My lord, I'm sorry, please speak to me." A moment passed, my existence focused on something more important than his whimpering. "My lord," he cried again, "in silence is too much." He clutched his armored head. suddenly sitting on the ground. The metal on his body clinked when the rogue that was watching from behind a corner darted away in panic, seeing the iron giant move. Guardian ignored him completely, though. "I have sinned, my lord." The insectoid dark form slumped even more. A broken being without a purpose, a weapon that he'd already sported, blunt, two-handed broadsword, was nowhere to be seen. His red eyes, 2 points of light in an otherwise black mass of metal, moved towards the ceiling. "I shall repent. My blood and those of the invading sentients shall paint your walls." His form condensed, a purpose found, standing up one of his hands and reaching out to a bundle of sanity wires. A moment after hesitation, he touched the glistening metal. "For the dungeon!" he shouted mentally, only to get instantly chided in the next second. "Shut up and let me finish my work, Guardian," I exploded, forced to hear his whiny nonsense for a long while. At worst, during so delicate a task, any bit of anima wasted was unrecoverable after all. "My lord, you speak!" he laughed rapidly. "Of course I speak, you fool. Can you see that I'm busy right now?" I snapped back, irritated at the childishness of my most powerful creation. I see. Blessed silence lasted only a few seconds. "What are you doing then, my liege?" He changed his words a bit, maybe understanding that my lord routine was starting to sound like mommy to my ears. "Preparing a way to the lower level for you." "And why would I need to go down there?" He sighed and spoke immediately, sensing his rising panic. "There is an undead down there who is not under my control." I started, only to get interrupted. "I see. As your strongest pawn, I shall dispatch this monstrosity in your holy name." He screamed zealously, his physical form flailing once again. And once again scaring the crap out of a ready returning scout. I decided once again to stop his unneeded enthusiasm. "Shut up. I just need you to communicate with her, not fight. She may become a servant yet." I mumbled the last of the words, remembering how Gangria called her a present. She was a bit damaged, but I had an idea of how to remedy that problem. Now only to negotiate. My attention turned to the present. Walls were changed, wires extended, and all in the complete silence. Meanwhile, the big child called the Guardian was staring daggers at humans, hoping that they were stupid enough to challenge him, even as he murmured under his helmet, loud enough to scare anyone peeking inside. One could say that without his weapon, his ability to kill, maim, and severely limited, and yet even if his armored hands were empty, the sheer bulk of my creation was enough to rend bones and smash any armor these pathetic humans could produce. Seeing him calm down, I continued my work and summoned a mace similar to the weapon used by Boulder the Half-Orc. Guardian swung his new toy with glee, while I used the time to describe Tina's character and sharing any knowledge about her and her companions that I could have access to. It wasn't much, yet for a few hours passed in a blink, humans relentlessly patrolling the first floor and digging away the new rooms to the east. A large amount of rock had already been excavated, and a new batch of workers descended into the darkness. This time, they weren't the miners, though, but artisans, architects, planners, and sculptors. As they practiced their craft, I was growing more and more certain that they worked on a bunker of sorts. What by disaster that they'd hoped to survive, that I did not know. Yes, people talked with each other in hushed tones. Yes, they stared at the shadows and prayed often than not. But the problem was that they weren't really specific. I just understood that something really bad was going down. The suspense was killing me. Not really. What does a dungeon crawl care about the problems of mortals? I grumbled a bit, my work nearing its finish, and decided to diverge even more. The earlier excursion taught me how to grow my cameras through the ground. This ability was now a part of my experience, something that I was able to do without much conscious effort. And since I needed knowledge, I focused on sending out 25 more. While the deed was being done, I taught the Guardian what I knew and the principles of communications. The theory, at least. I wasn't very good at it. By the time the rest of my work was finished, only 4 cameras were alive. The locals were quite present at squishing them whenever they showed up, all the while calling them devil eyes. Curious that this world had devils too. Then, again, in a place where gods were real, it wasn't far-fetched to have a thought that demons and devils too. Not that it mattered now. I used the survivors to confirm that something big was still going on. The traps were being built, palisades had already been finished, and a large plaza was full of constantly sparring soldiers and adventurers. I was glad that my cameras lacked any sense of smell. My view shifted. The tent was full of adventurers, dirty, loud, and full of testosterone. There was a discussion going. All this getting stronger at all costs bullcrap. A person in charge had been asked a few times to send a party or two into the dungeon, to gain experience and explore the second floor. For a moment I hoped for a bit of excitement. These people weren't even half as strong as the Swords of Hope, so they would get squashed. Sadly, their leader immediately refused, citing the princess's opinion as a reason. Contrary to my expectations, they simply swallowed the explanation. Not grumbling, secret plans, no nothing. I was feeling disappointed. At least the way down had been finished, and the Guardian was currently slowly lumbering down, trying to keep his large feet in the narrow steps and to not tumble down in an unsightly manner. Yep, that was an oversight on my part. Gotta remember to change that as soon as possible. Thankfully, he managed to get down without any problems and then safely emerged from the tunnel, all to meet our special guest. The girl in question was calmly lying on a stretcher while staring at the ceiling. She was muttering to herself. The loneliness, silence, and darkness weren't fazing her at all. She should feel right at home down here, according to Analyzer's description. Anyway, I ordered Guardian to come closer and repeat the asked order given, in a somewhat vain hope that he won't screw this up. Now ask her who she is, what she remembers, and what her goals are. And most importantly, do not slip up that you're asking on behalf of a dungeon core. I hissed, and my boss monster straightened his back even more. The last few steps of his red eyes stared at the pale face up close. Not the best position to start a conversation, staring someone down. Welcome to the dungeon, undead, he started, while the girl seemed to ignore his words and continued her mumbling. It was, however, noticeably slower now. Can you hear me? He repeated, waving a backhand before her. This got her attention. Who? She asked, throat having trouble speaking proper words. Me. I'm called Guardian, and I guard the dungeon's first floor entrance. You should remember me, he added, hoping that the recent battle would jumble her memory. Member, she growled. Fight, fear, battle. Her eyes focused suddenly, full of reason. Enemy. No, not anymore. The Guardian shook his head in denial. You're already dead, remember. No need to fight against the fellow undead. It took her a moment to understand. For the first time she really looked at her body. It was mutilated, pale, and dirty. She wasn't a sentient anymore. This knowledge seemed to sink in, nearly breaking her. But then, with a sudden influx of willpower, she clenched her fist. How? Not dead. No, you don't understand. You're one of us now. The Guardian gestured towards the nearby lever, having turned its skeletal head towards the girl. See this guy? You're similar. No, can't, too much. Her mood changed once again, black tears threatening to spill out from her unblinking eyes. Shh. Focus on the present. Leave the past behind. It's the only way, the Guardian coaxed her gently. Somehow used in the situation, his hand landed on the girl's shoulder, reassuring her. Then, in one swift motion, he undid her bonds and sat down, trembling like a small animal. And the mumbles had returned, only with the focus of the different words this time. No, sisters, she whispered while rocking back and forth, like a patient in a mental asylum. The living don't matter now, girl, Guardian rumbled. The dead are even more irrelevant. It's a new life on the other side of the barricade. You should have a single purpose now. What is it? He asked gently at the beginning. Seeing his charge descend into madness, he repeated the words, louder this time. What's your purpose? Silence. What is your purpose, girl? He shouted at the end, waking Tina up from her stupor. Black eyes stared at him unblinkingly, like the earlier humanity that she had shown was only a lie. The silence continued until a single word left her mouth. Revenge. She answered crisply. Her only hand tightened so hard that the black blood started to seep between her fingers. Good, the Guardian nodded, his voice once again calm and collected. Who is the target of your revenge? Gaynard Kingdom. Who? My servant simply repeated his question, forcing Tina to think, to search deeper into her newborn mind. Nobles, hawks, she iterated each word, each letter a leaders. All of the humans your targets, he reconfirmed. No, she shook her head in denial. No, not care. Do you remember anything else? Your friends, family, enemies? The Gaynard Kingdom you seem to hate so much. The Guardian kept his interrogation, but the only answer he got was an unblinking stare. Tina, former Swords of Hope rogue, seemed to be nothing much, but an empty husk right now. I can work with this, I mumbled. My lord? Guardian asked, shedding his older brother persona. Offer her a way to restore her limbs that she's lost, I ordered, staring at the seemingly calm revenant. What other terms should be then, my liege? None. Just let her sow chaos in the world. I grinned. Not that he could see what my face looked like right now. Not that I could see. Why, she could be groomed to become a powerful ally. And how would you control such a being? Isn't her goodwill a good enough bargaining chip? This world does not work that way, you know. Not between monsters, anyway. I sighed as a tempting proposition, but I sensed the trap. Gangria was content with sowing chaos everywhere. Somehow, I doubted that she would exclude me from her plans. But yeah, we should probably ask her for something. I guess hunting down and dragging back some of the larger creatures should suffice. More data to work with is always good. I said, mostly to myself. Do you have any preferences? Just not the bats. He visibly winced. Right. I stopped for a moment, thinking, searching for holes in my reasoning. There wasn't anything else that I wanted him to do. Then off you go. Negotiate, I ordered. The giant once again stomped close to Tina. She didn't react to his presence, still mumbling and staring into nothingness. Let's start again. He spoke and sighed in exasperation. What is your name? I already told you mine. None. You don't remember? He asked, trying to interpret her words. The Revenant shook her head in confirmation. None. You don't have a name then? A sharp nod. That's troubling. His head tilted. How should I call you then? You and Revenant are going to get stale real soon. The girl closed her eyes and started to think about the question. After a few minutes of deliberation, an answer came to her lips. None. Another sharp word escaped her mouth. I will call you Non then. Guardian nodded. What are your plans for the future then, Non? Kill. How? He asked while staring at her stumps. You lack a leg and an arm. You're weakened, and there are human warriors everywhere. You'll get killed as soon as you leave the second floor. The girl in question only stared, not moved by his simple analysis. And your vengeance will end unfulfilled. These words were effective, though. No! She twitched, trying to unsuccessfully stand up. Must kill. A wet stare once again found her anchor on the Guardian's red-eyed helmet. Help, she said unabashedly. I can help you. Lion's face brightened up, but there is always a price. Her smile was immediately replaced with wariness. Oh, don't look at me like that, the Guardian grumbled. It's nothing much. I can use some of the powers hidden in this place, but in turn, you should hunt some animals and drag them back inside once you get better. That's what I meant as payment. Kill. She shook her head in denial. Listen, you can't be the only one to gain something in this transaction. The world just doesn't work that way. If you don't want to, I'll just leave you to your own devices. There is no rush. There was a smile in his voice. I'll be over there, he added, while pointing to the nearby lakeside, and then walked away with a steady gait. He sat at a fairly flat rock, simply waiting for her response. Minutes passed in silence until the Guardian decided to interrupt the calm with his mental voice. Talking with her reminded me of my younger sister, he said while staring at the waves. She was also taciturn and stubborn. Where is she now? I asked. Dead. I see. I can remember her figure, voice, and even the things she said. The giant stopped, his fists clenched. Why can't I remember her name or her face? I do not know, I answered softly. Yes, I'm sorry, my liege. I guess when we return from death there is always a price to pay. He grumbled under his nose. I should consider myself lucky. That girl, she lost everything. but her revenge. And how do you know that? Her emptiness feels similar to mine, only it's deeper. Much deeper. Aren't you afraid she won't come? Oh, she'll come, he paused, scratching the wires extending from the back of his head. People like her, people like me, we're always moved by the single-minded purpose. She knows we hold the keys to her freedom. A few more minutes later, his prophecy came true, as Non dragged her half-destroyed body along the ground, leaving a thin, snake-like trail. She appeared determined, her only arm clutching the earth and rock. Have you decided? The Guardian turned his head to look at her. Yes, exchange. Good. You go then, he said, and he lifted her small body up in his arms. She struggled for a moment, surprised, but soon stopped moving altogether. You, he pointed to the one of the Libras mulling nearby, get the core and bring it here, he ordered, while simultaneously speaking mentally. My lord, please, with grandeur, if possible. Yes, yes. The Libra in question simply walked into the lake, travelling down into my hidden but fake core room. The normal poker face that Non sported changed as she understood that something was down there, deep underwater. Something important. It took almost 30 minutes to prepare my soldiers, heavily armoured Libras flanked by the electric and exploding brothers. The one in the middle was the Fail Smith brother, another bile-brain golem encased in dark armour. In his hands the dungeon core rested, suffused with the air of its power. Both the carrier and the surrounding soldiers were travelling slowly. Both the undead and golems can travel underwater, but it was hard work to get your way against the pressure. More importantly, the minions walking had most of the attention focused on the core and its carrier. I quickly analysed my substitute, finding it the same as before. Mechanical core gem. This mechanical creation is indistinguishable from the real dungeon core for the sapient races. It has the ability to give orders to the dungeon creations and even to attack and defend its own. The communication ability is restricted at least part mechanical creations. It can be subordinated to the dungeon core or left on its own devices after giving orders. As such, it allows the grow of the dungeon influence even outside of normal borders. The additional effect is cleansing the surrounding mana, while converting most biological and mechanical life forms into dungeon-created ones. The ability to attack and shield with electricity allows for a modicum of self-defense, but the real strength of the mechanical core is the ability to direct and create new beings. Due to its nature, the amount of subordinate cores that you can possess is directly linked to the core level. Threat level D-. The additional effect of cleansing the surrounding mana while converting most biological and mechanical life forms into dungeon-created ones. I mouthed the words, a little surprised. I did not have any means to control her. Yet. My cautiousness also disallowed me to convert her immediately. The risk was simply too great. Who knows what she could have done until then to completely taken over. But this, a way to strengthen her and then let my influence slowly grow, only to win out in the end. I grinned maniacally, my non-existent face full of ecstasy. Do it, I ordered. The core and the computer-like beep of acknowledgement echoed in my mind. I wondered, was that something created from my memories, or were mechanical beings just similar even when created by a wholly different worlds? As I mused, the power that resonated from the mechanical core was growing stronger and more focused. The fake core looked just like me, an onyx gem, about 15 centimeters in diameter. But the power it wielded was different from my own. The color and the intent were different. Instead of electricity, a cone of bronze energy suddenly expanded from it, covering both the newly named Non and the Guardian. The girl twitched in surprise, while my servant stoically waited for the process to end. The scream came, and then another one. Weird living metal was growing on Non's body, the infection starting at her stomach region. Unlike any metal known to man, the blackish substance breathed in and out with each passing second. The energy that it carried seeped into the revenant's flesh. It was strengthening it and somehow regenerating appendages that were lost. Besides muscles, bones were getting grown from nothingness, and the rest of the metal started to cover the nearly naked body, devouring the bits of flesh and any clothing, more like rags, that were still left. Liquid like iron draped itself off of each centimeter of the pale body and then retreated, building a light armor similar to the one she wore when she was alive. Chest, arm, and leg pieces appeared before my eyes. Then the metal retreated, leaving a finishing touch, a black mask covering her whole face. It was a simple, oval piece of equipment with slits for her eyes. And then it was over. Non's moans of pain slowly died down as my subcorps retreated with its retinue, their job done already. What was lying in the Guardian's burly arms was completely different-looking revenant. Analyze. Iron-melded revenant, named Non, a type of cursed undead returning to haunt the living to exact her revenge. Parts of her body are made from iron, creating a functioning body. A combination of golem-like arm and leg with pale flesh, combined to create a form of a young woman. Her brown, braided hair and black eyes look human enough on first glance, but the stench of death that permeates her surroundings quickly reveals her true nature. Revenants are masters of death magic in many forms. This being uses her newfound power to hide and ambush her foes. The darkness is her home, and the two corroded daggers on her waist are much more dangerous than they look. Her small frame may be mistaken for a child, as all the revenants that she has a target of her revenge, the Gaynor Kingdom, which mistreated her and starved to death her younger siblings, while she was outside, serving the nobility's interest. Threat level D++. Perfect, I smiled, and then she was gone. Guardian panicked, getting into a defensive stance, while the rest of my servants looked around dully. Undead weren't too bright after all. None had already departed on the second floor after all. How did I know that? Well, she wasn't exactly stealthy when Gaynor Kingdom patrols were in her way. Screams and the smell of blood followed her every movement. People falling killed or dying with their throats sliced by an unseen monster. Some were running, others simply prayed for the unfeeling gods. None were spared. And in their absence, my dungeon released the pent-up stress. Both undead and bosses returned to defend me. Decapitator, Jella Jonathan, and the Libras were all being summoned one by one. I caught a glimpse of her black iron armor as she stood near the stairs leading outside. Her eyes were still completely black, and she turned to give one last long look at my dungeon's interior. I could hear her scoff. Not wanting to keep your part of the deal, girl, I laughed soundlessly. The Guardian outside of my range right now. Now I knew why villains tended to project their plans when encountering a hero. It feels so good. Don't worry, I wasn't the one to keep mine anyway. A manic grin once again grew on my face. See you later, I sent to her mind. She twitched with disgust and ran into the encampment premises. Screams followed. End of chapter. Chapter 46. Uno. It was only a few solid hours later that the sounds of battle quietened and then disappeared completely. Non had successfully escaped after exacting her revenge, if the dark faces of the returning soldiers were any indication. Unlike before, the Sentients were concentrated strictly on guarding the entrance room. Their sentries comprised of mostly battered and bandaged people. No more forays into the dungeon, and no loud, haughty conversation told the story of their dire defeat. At the same time, my decapitator was up and running again, his thirsty blades etching the scars after scar in the stone tunnels just behind the corner. There wasn't much of the smile brain of his, but I clearly felt the desire for revenge. A rip and a tear. Yet for now there was no chance to do so. I gathered the contents of the hushed whispers that Sentients shared over smouldering campfires. It quickly became clear that most of the battle-capable soldiers remained on the surface. Ergo, the threat up there was much greater than underground. Something was coming and I could feel it. But like before, I had no reasonable options to interfere with the outside world. Because of that, life as my halls returned to its earlier tranquility, interrupted only by the workers' relentless digging. It was a calm if one ignored the dungeon call's ethereal body, currently bashing its head against the wall. It was a futile endeavor, seeing as the walls were real and I was not. The reason for such behavior? I was lamenting on my total unnecessarily cockiness. It was just like me trying to look cool only to get kicked in the balls. Why did I send the last mental comment to Non's mind? All this time I endured and let Guardian do the honors. He was leading the Revenant in and controlling her until the girl was convinced that every step she took was out of her own volition. The trap was set, ready to snap, and in the last possible moment, I just had to frack with her. Yes, I was giddy. Everything was going my way for once, and now somebody knew that I was a sentient dungeon. God damn it, why did I do that? Stupid, stupid, stupid. Ugh. Well, let's calm down. Maybe the situation isn't that bad. The undead girl only knew that someone other than the Guardian had the ability to communicate mentally in my dungeon. At least I wasn't dumb enough to actually introduce myself. Non's ability to speak was pretty non-existent too, so the chance for her to slip up and divulge my existence was minimal. Who knew, however, if this would change with time? The next problem, she was bound to encounter some powerful individuals on a quest for vengeance. I was certain that both nobles and royalty had capable bodyguards in their employ, not to mention some of them being powerful warriors and mages themselves was a distinct possibility. I still remembered that the people who managed to conquer my first floor were all royals, a noble and their retainers. This meant that she could easily get captured. Another unpleasant notion. There might be a ways of extracting knowledge from an undead, just like I did with the Guardian. Stupid! I once again bashed my ethereal head against the wall. There was also a chance of betrayal, changing sides, as she wasn't one of my creations after all. Her blatant disregard for our deal only reinforced that notion. All this thinking was giving me shivers. Whatever, I don't care. Out of sight, out of heart. Whatever happens, happens. Little just focused on the important and interesting tasks, namely that without any further fanfare or cultivation like epiphanies, I had gained a level. Yep, all these weak soldiers killed by the rampaging undead weren't that fitting. But be it bread or rice, the sheer number of dead carved by Non's black-hand blades were more than enough to push me over the threshold. And because of that, I could gaze at my new status with pride. Like so. Race, Dungeon Core, Name Uno, Dungeon Core Level 2. Affinity, Electricity, Element, Anima. Location, Henrik Walzer Ruined Castle, Dungeons. Magic none, skills none. Innate abilities, Magic Sight, Anima Manipulation, Electricity Encroachment. The empty magic and skills part was hurting my gamer's soul, yet there was little I can do to fill them in. The only speech-capable monster in my dungeon, Guardian, was clueless when it came to such things, which may or may not have stemmed from a thorough brainwashing that I put him through, and there was no way in hell that I would ask the sentients for help. But then again, nothing that some kind of torture wouldn't solve, now that I had a willing mouthpiece to ask questions. These were plans for the future, though, and there was no time like the present. My first instinct was to dig, to burrow deeper and further away from the greedy sentients. I found that feeling with all my might, barely stopping myself from ordering my sturdy stone drones. The usually calm stone dolls seemed to be a bit more active right now, likely sensing my excitement. Unlike most of my creations, these guys were only useful when another level was being excavated. I had no ability to dig on my own, but somehow managed to easily maintain my tunnels and caves. I guess that was what happened when every stone and brick on the wall was a part of my giant organism. Anyways, I managed to suppress my innate desire to burrow and decided to focus instead on the creation of another subordinate core. While I wasn't using them much in the past, the recent incident with Tina, or rather Non, clearly proved their worth. They had a different skill set from mine, and it was time to use them for something else other than dungeon slaver's bait. At least a new one. I summoned my mana and forced it into an already familiar shape. It was easier this time, just putting the gaps between reality and slowly feeding an emerging monster. I started with a newborn core with a strange sense of camaraderie and an innate understanding. It was my servant, bound and ready to fight. I knew that it would look just like me, with an onyx-like smooth surface and the darkest blackness swirling inside. Except it didn't. Or rather, there was a notable difference between my shape and the other subcore and this newcomer. The aura that swirled around it reminded me of old, crusty blood. "Analyze," I whispered quietly. "Mechanical core gem, curse. The mechanical creation is indistinguishable from the real dungeon core for the sapient races. It has the ability to give orders to dungeon creations and to attack and defend on its own. The communication ability is restricted to the least part mechanical creations. It can be subordinated to the dungeon core or left to its own devices after giving orders. As such, it allows growing the dungeon influence even outside in normal borders. The additional effect is cleansing the surrounding mana, while converting most biological and mechanical lifeforms to dungeon-created ones. This specific gem has been changed by the residual energies of the soul devoured by the dungeon. Because of this, the new ability to create cursed equipment has been added. Unlike its creator and the predecessor, this gem also produces an unhealthy reddish glow. Threat level D-. Oh, that's new. Did that mean that my actions had consequences, even when creating new minions? Would that mean that I could force some evolutions on my Libras and Rattlings, or maybe even the Bile Brain Golem? I already started to experiment with this direction, but seeing no results, I simply abandoned this avenue of research. Should I try and create a Godoku? Space normally filled with poisonous worms that would devour each other until the strongest one remained. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Let's keep that thought. But, cursed weapons, you say, Analyze. I could work with that. From what I gathered listening to the sentries' conversations, most of the dungeons had some kind of trial with which the challenger had to prove themselves worthy and then receive a prize. Said prize being often a weapon, armor, or an otherwise magical item. A foolish notion, but one that I couldn't escape in my pursuit to grow less conspicuous. As in, I'm not a sentient dungeon, folks. Kinda way. One could, of course, say that my uniqueness was already set in stone, but I desperately wanted to remain as standard as I could, since unremarkable was already out of the question. Yet it just didn't sit right in me to simply bestow my enemies with weapons or armor, be it of the average quality that I was capable of. Thus, with this ability to create cursed armaments, I had another avenue to choose. Lovely. There was also other things to consider. For one, I forcefully switched Guardian's position with the enhanced golem that earlier guarded the underground core room. The fake one, of course, as my own position remained entrenched on the first floor, in the isolated chamber. The big guy whimpered for a bit, unwilling to leave his home, but I quickly managed to convince him that the whole dungeon was something too akin to his manor now. Only then he moved to the underwater tunnel and further down, into the lonely room that guarded one of the two planned ways down. While he moved, I closed the ceiling trenches, effectively confining him to his new place. The plan was to lead him even deeper, but that had to wait. I felt nearly physical need to dig down, but not yet. Not yet, Juno. Stay strong. Instead of going down, I ordered my stone drones to dig east from the rat beast holding pen. They then turned towards the place of nearly rapid fashion, zealously scratching at the stone and dirt, their moves more similar to how animals tore their victims' flesh apart than the calm construction workers building a new annex. Large, gorilla-like rat beasts growled at the sudden intrusion, but considering the newcomers weren't made of edible material, that just let out a go. An instinctive feeling of belonging, which usually connected the dungeon residents, helped too. Not even an hour passed when my little minions managed to excavate a sizable room. Good. I sent, despite not understanding me in the slightest. The drones rejoiced. Was it me, or were they looking a bit more, alive right now? No matter. I smiled and sent a few of the Libras to fetch the flame caller, Iron Flame Rat King. He normally lounged in the south part of the dungeon, the place where the Iron Flame Rats turned into something like a combination of a temple and a training grounds. They sparred there constantly, slowly building up the organized and bloody structure. Now that I think it wasn't that clear of an indication that the surroundings had a direct effect on the individual's evolution paths. How did I not notice it earlier? Was I growing dumber? No matter. the hulking 3-meter-tall flamecaller arrived, flanked by his 2 Iron Flame Rat Temple Warriors, and about 10 simple lesser Denomic Iron Flame Rats. He barely squeezed through the tunnels dug for much smaller beings. At least the newly dug room was nice and spacious, easily capable of holding the Rat King and his retinue. It was the right time to introduce them to the visiting adventurers and soldiers, or anybody else stupid enough to invade my dungeon. The system calling him the king really did a giant rat warrior justice. He looked a bit like the rat beasts that currently were busy trying to meld into the walls, all the while whimpering in fear. His 2 massive clawed feet were used to lumber from one place to another. He looked powerful, but slow, yet I knew that his looks were deceiving. Once or twice I saw him soaring through the air like death incarnate. On top of his head there was a red crest stood proudly, while the rest of the rats' faces and bodies were covered in the sturdy scar tissue of natural leather armor. Seeing that both of my entrance points were secure, I let out all the ordered stone diggers to dig. They reacted without hesitation, and I felt another barrier crumble as 2 downstairs were being made, one near the underwater tunnel and the second behind the rat beast pens. I willed them to converge into one position, and they did. Thanks to the servant genius of the stone drones, a 3rd level was being made, and my head was already full of ideas to implement. My minions created with 2 stairways descending inside. There was an ending to the west and east of the room. This way, anyone dumb enough to check the second one would have to contend with the boss. I also ordered the drones to carve 4 statues into the corners of the room. They froze, not understanding what the order meant. I sighed, sharpening my image. Sentient, with a magic staff, one hand lifted in the air. Sentient, with a bow, ready to strike at an unseen foe. Sentient, with a large mace and a tower shield. Sentient, with 2 daggers and a hunched posture. The diggers threw themselves at the work, full of fervor. Too bad that their skills were lacking. What I ended up with were 4 statues of, something. For an objective standpoint, they looked more like prisoners half plunged into the earth than trying to desperately crawl their way out. Their faces were indistinct but open to silent screaming, weapons no more than broken and rusted sticks, deformed flesh slowly being devoured by the greedy earth. I could work with this ambience. Behind each statue I ordered the alcove to be dug out, and then a rock lid fitted in place, creating a small empty space. Ratlings were already digging through the 3rd floor, spreading the network of tunnels. So it took a little nudge to lead them towards the room. In a few more minutes levers and mechanisms were fitted by their tails and claws, similarly to how the spear traps on the first room worked. Only instead of spears, I had hidden Libra exploders in the alcoves. I had finished the preparations and was going to give out orders when a blue box appeared in front of me. "Frick!" I cursed, seeing the contents. "You have created a statue entrance room." This room, unlike most entrances, was fitted with deadly traps, and was thus converted into a veritable trap room. The rules of a trap activation are as follows. An adventurer attacks the statue in the room. An adventurer attacks another adventurer in the room. An adventurer attacks a non-aggressive monster in the room. Yeah, frick you too, Gangria. Then again, monsters were not aggressive. I had a ton of these. Immediately one of the stone drones was chosen and ordered to stay in the entrance room. After a minute of thought, I ordered it to carve in the surrounding walls and even allowing the drone to gather materials from the surroundings. It nodded gently. The drone wouldn't fit anymore, so I simply decided to call it Sculptor. And then nothing happened. Duh. It was not like a simple naming ceremony was that big of a deal. I mean, yeah, it was important, but the name came after a purpose. This was the purpose that led to the process of evolution. A need to acquire something, an individuality. That's what I was thinking right now, anyway. The flow of life would surely verify my knowledge. The next room came to life pretty fast too, and the next 11 rooms with it. Only a few days passed, but I was so enthused that I had hardly noticed. An obvious advantage to becoming a dungeon core, no more bathroom breaks and an annoyingly growling stomach. Goodbye sleep and tiredness. The rock was harder down here and less soil present. More desperate stone with some ores were present. Nothing special was found, though. Copper, iron, and some coal. No hidden hoard. No skeletons. In the end, I waited for the drones to finish and started working on the smallish room south of the entrance. After a second, I filled up the devil eyes and their half-mechanical eyes tracking any movement. From my earlier experiments, I knew that these plant-like cameras were considered a source of the curse and bad luck of the sentients. This little psychological play was, however, only prelude. The large doors that were carved in the stone and then covered a thin layer of gold and a few precious stones. I could scramble. Probably the useless gesture of sentients was sure to steal anything not nailed down to the floor. But it fit, and that was also why I ordered my freshly minted sculptor to start working on 2 blocks of stone standing near it. It had to focus on a simple expression: greed. Sadly, the newly made individual was lost, just like his brothers before. I guess there was too much to expect from him right now. A fat merchant clutching a bag of gold coins spilling. The sculpture started moving a bit, yet it still looked shocked. If a faceless stone doll could have any expressions anyway. Then I sent another image and it once again stood there, overwhelmed. A woman pointing at a merchant, armor guards running from behind her. I chuckled for a bit. I guess all of these new words, fat, merchant bag, gold, coins, woman, guard, armored, these were new concepts, and the information that came with them were a bit too much. I left the pondering creation alone, smoothing the rooms out and connecting them with similar doors. The drones worked and I put the finishing touches. 1 room on the left and 1 room on the right. Repeat. Chamber of daggers, chamber of swords, chamber of axes, chamber of spears, chamber of maces, chamber of shields, chamber of helmets, chamber of breastplates, chamber of greaves. The great greed hallway. In each of these a bile brain golem, and as a finishing touch, a larger room with a larger bile brain golem. Unlike the others, this creation of mine had 6 arms, 3 on each side, and a special chamber that allowed it in its chest. My newest faint core was implemented within, and the golem changed. Analyze. Bile cursed golem. This creature is a fusion of bone, dead flesh, metal, and stone, created to do its master's bidding. The metal parts, breastplate, greaves, gauntlets, helmet, and mace are magical items carrying various curses in exchange for destructive power. While strong and robust, it is not very intelligent, but due to being partially from the earth, it retains its stubbornness. Given any task, the golem will try to finish it to the best of its abilities. The large mass of slow movements make this being a perfect shield for others. It is, however, slow to heal, as the material was made from it somewhat rare. At the same time, due to its rarity, knowledgeable adventurers will hunt it down to the ends of the world, especially because of the magical items it's wearing. Threat level D++. It growled, a curious sound considering the lack of a mouth. The items it wore languished on the other sides, screams of tormented souls, fiery auras, cold crystals materializing from thin air. The cursed golem just stood in the middle, eyes aghast with a red color. I smiled with another sound of notification resounding through the air. I was right. A trial was created. Trial of Greed has been created. Your dungeon has become a host of a first trial. The trial encompasses Hall of Eyes, Chamber of Daggers, Chamber of Swords, Chamber of Axes, Chamber of Spears, Chamber of Maces, Chamber of Shields, Chamber of Helmets, Chamber of Gauntlets, Chamber of Breastplates, Chamber of Greaves, the Great Greed Hallway, and the Cursed Golem Enclosure. The rules of the trial as follows. The challengers are allowed into the Great Greed Hallway unless they damaged anything in the Hall of Eyes. The challengers are allowed to enter any of the chambers while defeating the golems inside. The golems are armed with 1 piece of cursed equipment each. Each defeated golem adds its piece of equipment to the cursed golem. The main trial begins when the challenger opens up the cursed golem enclosure or eliminates all the auxiliary golems. Once the challengers enter the Great Greed Hallway, they cannot escape. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. That's some insane difficulty, and the reward for all of this hard work is a cursed magical item. Perfect. Now I only had to order a sculptor to work a bit on the eaves of carving to actually represent the pieces of equipment. I felt like singing. "My lord?" A sour voice interrupted my self-congratulatory session. "What is it, Guardian?" I sighed, expecting another complaint about his new home. "I think something's not right," he answered hesitantly. "Huh?" My mind snapped back to the dungeon, noticing the now fully staffed and guarded complex on the first floor. The civilians were in the middle of the evacuation. I moved my attention towards the surface, searching the surroundings through my few remaining cameras. And, as I thought, there were people standing in the shade of walls, soldiers, adventurous mages, all of them clutching their weapons, cold sweat visible on their faces. Their stillness was foreboding, the silence full of tension. I followed their gazes and looked towards the tree line. There were monsters. Various races squirmed and roaring, their deformed silhouettes emanating bloodlust and a desire to kill and devour. I could recognize the small and hunched goblins, armed with sticks and stones, the muscular and fang-faced orcs, the boulder-like trolls, centaurs with vicious features, goat-like legs and hairy satyrs, giants, werewolves, lizardmen, nagars, and more. A horde was approaching. I should be afraid. But instead, the only feeling I felt was hunger. For their bodies and their souls. End of chapter. Chapter 47. My cameras were observing the delicate balance between the two armies. A solemn atmosphere, vicious gazes. On the one side, humans closely guarded the impromptu outpost. A rather large squad of shielded spearmen and supporting troops were deployed outside. Their aim seemed to both provoke and intercept anyone stupid enough to attack without a plan. A passive strategy for waiting for the enemy to move. Then again, as an outnumbered side, there wasn't much more that they could do. On the palisade behind them, numerous mages and archers stood at the ready. I zoomed in only to see a pale, sweaty expressions all over. The morale wasn't high. The commanders, who were pacing a few steps behind the soldiers, didn't look any better. But under this panic, their strained nerves, there was something else. A sense of purpose, a wild hope. These people had a plan, a chance to survive. Their faces told me as much. Between the static spearmen, some teams of adventurers slowly moved from one place to another, easily recognizable by the mismatch of armor and the use of strange weapons. The faces looked full of fear and tension too, but some enjoyed the atmosphere, the excitement. The crazy ones, the adrenaline junkies, that was what they were called, right? But nothing was happening. Nobody made the first move. Yet, I turned back to the monsters, like bored teenagers switching the TV channels. At first glance, they were a chaotic blob of different races and languages, more and less barbaric depending on the species. There was no sense of purpose, no leaders, nothing. Just a wild, crazy horde. And yet, after a few minutes of observation, I noticed that I was wrong. There were some rules pertaining to their behavior, like how the bigger and stronger monsters were concentrated in the middle of the group. They, also, were the ones with fewer deformities and wearing way better equipment, mostly made out of metal, which contrasted with stone, wood, and leather common amongst the rest of the horde. It seemed like there was a clear structure, with all the smaller, mostly less intelligent goblins, kobolds, or even lizardmen and orcs being both a vanguard and a scout for the more important and powerful beings. It was a simple tribal structure, but hey, it worked, especially because, as I saw, the defiant monsters were devoured by the leaders. Against the giants, trolls, and ogres camping in the middle, a small group of many different beings caught my attention. They seemed to be heterogeneous, comprised of many different races. While the largest of them were giants, it was not uncommon to see a naga, orc, or even a goblin walk by, undisturbed by the other, theoretically stronger beings. The one thing that they had in common were staves, more like sticks, with human skulls embedded on them. Each of these, let's call them tribal shamans, radiated an aura of magic, but not mystical stuff. A literal colorful aura that could be seen with the naked eye. Blue, red, yellow, green, and so on. Even so, the biggest of the other monsters seemed to avoid them, leaving the rather large stretch of no man's land between the middle of the horde, Their appearance also seemed to rouse the humans. In a bad way. "Nobody said that they'd have mages," shouted a large armored man who was the commander of the defense. Red-haired mage called Charles. "We're screwed. Totally screwed. They're going to take my Nadia's head and mount it on a spike," he mumbled while shaking. "This was always one of the predicted outcomes. We will survive nonetheless." The noble answered calmly, looking down on the man from his platform located on the palisade. "Lies!" the warrior yelled back, ignorant of the gazes of pity that the surrounding soldiers showered him with. "You and your noble friends are going to hide in the dungeon while we bleed and fight for you." He screamed even louder. "Let us down there too." "That's an interesting thing you said, considering that I'm standing right here and it is you who wants to whimper and hide. Are you saying that I'm a coward?" "Worse," the red-haired man smirked. "A dead coward." "Huh?" "Flame bolt," he chanted quickly and threw a fiery projectile right into the man's chest. It lodged deeply, burning flesh and filling the air with his screams, and once more for good reason. Firebolt. The second one seemed to be more accurate than the first, entering through the already dying man's eye, killing him instantly. The soldiers stood around shocked, not knowing how to react, while the adventurers murmured angrily. The situation was volatile, but Charles immediately grabbed the chance to defuse it. "Do you see how the cowardice ends?" he asked while pointing at the half-burned body. "We need to be strong, we need to be courageous, and we need to act according to the plan." "Understood?" "Sir, yes, sir!" The soldier saluted, while the adventurers grudgingly bowed. The people who had been in a party with the departed especially had to stifle their anger. Somehow they managed to do it, but not before sending a few furious glances up at the noble. "Now get to your posts and prepare to fight. Remember, do not lay down your life thoughtlessly. We have a way out, and until it came true, if each of us will fulfill our duties." The commotion ended, and the only people left were Charles and his few adjutants. "Make sure somebody cleans up this waste," he said to nobody in particular. "I need a moment." The surrounding people looked at each other, confused. "A moment alone," he repeated. "Adam, stay please." He added that the old butler was ready to leave with the others. With a small bow, the silver-haired servant stood behind his master's back. "Do you think I was too harsh?" Charles asked while staring at the horde. "We willingly burdened you with this task. There are no bad decisions now, only more or less costly, sir." "I see." The mage glanced at his soldiers, once again ready to fight. "I want friends of this man and not to survive the battle, one way or another." His red eyes searched for the orderly ranks. This should subdue any notions of disrespecting nobility. "It shall be done." The butler only smiled and bowed to Charles and left. A solemn sigh escaped the man's lips. Only I was here to hear it, though. It was time to switch the channel. There were 4 cameras left, giving me sufficient view of the battlefield. A flat plain with only a few of the silvery tree stumps was surrounding the oval outpost. It was hard to believe that just a few days ago this place was a jungle. Now, in the middle of this devastation was a palisade of shadow trench, filled with sharpened sticks. The only road towards the gate was blocked by a large contingent of soldiers and adventurers, and they stood guard quietly, while waiting for their enemy to move. Some of the mages and archers joined them as support, but these were mostly comrades of the vanguard's adventurers. Behind them, on a specifically prepared platforms, archers and uniformly clothed mages waited in anticipation. The said mages were mostly using violet or robes, with a few exceptions of red, yellow, and light blue garbs. I couldn't see any civilians, which was pretty obvious in hindsight, considering that pretty much all of them were hidden in the newly excavated area. The air tensed for a moment as the horde started to move. It was sudden, primal action. The Kobold's goblins ran ahead, their small figures and primitive weapons looking comical, if not for the human faces' sharp teeth and common deformities. There weren't any recognizable words in the shouts that they produced, and I watched as the whole lot of them crashed into the human warriors. The soldiers armed with shields and spears stood in line, barely hampered by the senseless wailing. From behind them, adventurer teams were slipping in and out, leaving a bloody trail behind them. An interesting combination, because, as far as I knew, spying on the sentients being my new hobby, a common soldier was a level 1, maybe a level 3 being, and yet they stood their ground against an army a few times bigger. These little beasts were outmatched, but they didn't break. They bit the humans and ankles, tried to spit in their eyes, or cut any part of their clothing that they were not armored. It was even a bit adorable, if not for their full of madness single-mindedness. It reminded me of how my dungeon creatures tended to throw their lives away to please me. After a few minutes of harassment, most of the wave's monsters were dispatched, and a loud, deep sound resounded in the background. Not that I thought about it was here before, when the goblins charged, yet this time I managed to identify the source. It was the horn from some large beast, mounted on a stable platform that used a giant cloud of wooden armor. Well, calling it an armor might have been an overstatement, since it was simply a large door held by some ropes. Anyway, it signaled something, but I wasn't sure what. The little goblins and kobolds knew, though. They shrieked in shrill voices while gesticulating towards the human defensive line. Some of the men spewed curses in response, others simply prayed. The second wave of creatures emerged from the horde, this time reinforced with groups of orcs, lizardmen, and satyrs. Unlike the predecessors, these medium-sized monsters were using leather armor and had weapons other than clubs at their disposal. They were still crude and rusted, probably scavenged from the fallen, but a jump in quality was clearly visible. Unlike before, there was a commotion. The people on the walls were preparing, counting arrows, gathering their thoughts, getting into position. The horde advanced, many monsters growling and shouting with excitement. They crossed an invisible line, and so an order was given. Fire! A cloud of arrows flew through the air and skewing many of the enemies. The line wavered, but it was still not enough. The ones pushed from the back forced the remaining creatures to advance. Then the spells arrived. The fireballs burned the advancing monsters to a crisp. The ice flowers froze them into abstract forms, and the earthen spikes broke them apart. Violet energy similar to lightning fell from the sky, only to burn and cut and maim, stopping the enemies in their tracks. I observed this magical hurricane in awe. For a moment it seemed like sheer power of the human produced would be enough to keep their enemies at bay. Then a horn sounded again, and more medium and small-sized monsters arrived from the battlefield. Some hesitated, some tried to run when arriving in the death zone, but in the end, their sheer bulk was enough to push through. But it wasn't enough to avoid falling into another trap. The earth was standing on gave way and broke under their weight, 100 monsters falling to their deaths. Onto the sharp sticks below, a large trench was uncovered, the one that the humans were digging earlier. I wondered where it disappeared to. Sounds of pain and exertion followed the smaller monsters, who were squashed by the larger ones, while all of them received some concussions, bruises, and cuts. The unlucky ones were killed instantly. The hole was wide enough to block the whole approach a few meters deep, ending in a rocky flat surface which reminded me of something. The human warriors cheered loudly, seeing another wave of invaders meet their doom, some of them even shooting arrows and magic towards the helpless monsters. They were yelling for wasting ammunition. A wise decision as the horde grew even more restless with another horn sounding in the air. More monsters were coming. Hearing the echo, these imprisoned in the ditch grew frantic, frightfully grabbing at the loose dirt and stones, trying to claw their way out. The spearmen weren't having any of it, their sharp weapons poking out the eyes and skin, instantly forcing the orcs to tumble back down. The lizardmen were better off, their natural armor allowing them easier endure the abuse. Still, an accurate hit was enough to blind any of the advancing braves. More importantly, those standing watch over their makeshift moat knew that they couldn't allow a single monster to gain ground on the other side. The desperate struggle continued, while the horn sounded a different note. Like before, goblins, kobolds advanced, same with the orcs and the other brutes, but the ones flanking their advances were Nagas and centaurs, half humans, half horses, and half humans, half snakes, now fitting for the sentients to meet their end at the cousins' hands. The centaurs accelerated immediately, their long legs giving them an advantage. Barely any of them wore furs, but each had a spear and another long weapon. Their speech was incoherent, and each of the advancing warriors bore a sign of disease: broken skin, unseeing eyes, an infected wound. The braves leapt, and they jumped over the dry moat and landed amidst the defenders. Most of them were slaughtered with a brutal battle, but some managed to hold their ground long enough for reinforcements to arrive. The Nuggers used their serpentine movements to easily scale the moat walls, while dual-wielding their sharp swords, spears, and axes. The upper part of their bodies looked human-like, but anybody seeing their eyes would say otherwise. Those were Naga men, with naked chests and bald heads. Their advance was calm, silent, and felt inevitable, as they slithered with the practiced movements, each of them trying to cut the legs of their opponents, only to finish them with a bite of their unnaturally widened jaws. This battle seemed to turn against the humans, something that I wasn't too worried about. After all, as an observer, I was sure to weather any incursions from the horde. I even welcomed it, especially these shamans with their skull-like accessories. A notion of neutrality that was overturned in a few seconds later. "Do it, mage!" Joel snapped at his second-in-command, a violet-robed elder in a strange helmet. "Yes, yes," so impatient, the man in question murmured. He raised his hand upward, and the rest of the similarly clothed wizards followed his example. In a second, he started to murmur, violent energy collecting in his palm. The rest of the surrounding people also chanted, their spheres seemingly significantly smaller, but looking no less dangerous. 30 seconds passed, the air humming with contorted power. And then, disintegrate. He breathed out exhaustedly. Arcane Lance. The rest followed with a slightly different spell. A while later, the old man's spell flew towards one part of the moat, while the combined arcane lances moved to the other. With the difference of the disintegration just left a trail of monsters turned to ash, until it impacted the ground, tearing a large chunk out of it, while the arcane lances, on the other hand, simply cut through the enemies, puncturing anything in the way until exploding, and also tearing a large chunk out of the ground. There was no pain, no fear, just the sound of escaping mana, similar to a kettle of boiling water. It was then that I understood. These freckers were drilling holes into my dungeon. A moment later, I lost direct control over my cameras and my network, the severed cables no longer sending the data towards my core. I gasped. The loss of sight was always painful. Thankfully, the cables, the network were just crutches. I could still search the first level manually. So I did. There were 2 large holes, 2 breaches, one located in the twisted tunnels and the other in the conservatory. The latter was more important, as it pretty much severed my ability to influence the walls, to shape them. It could start to crumble at any moment now. What was worse, that the humans were evacuating downstairs. Filthy cowards! Move, move! Shouted the sergeants, while pushing their men down the stairs in orderly fashion. Adventurous lost soldiers later, majors first, remember your training. People shouted, fear nearly visible in the air. Keep them away. They're not moving. Good. Use the time wisely. Run. Orderly. Ballard's chest. Orderly, I said, freckers. Master Vincent, Charles, the red-haired noble, yelled. Yes, with a small smile, an absent-minded old man. No. A terrifying mage answered his question. He was still observing the aftermath of his work. Are you sure that the monsters will focus on these holes? Yes, but not exclusively. The biggest, like the giants, will wander off in time. The medium and large abominations will flock to the new entrances like moths to a flame. The small creatures, who knows? His brow scrunched. Also, we didn't foresee the arrival of the shamans. They're the bad news, those ones. Any weaknesses? The younger man asked briskly. No, not that I know much about them anyway. Not my venue of research. Not to mention each of them is different. Their discussion had been interrupted by the arriving messenger. Sir, most of our forces are already in the shelter. We are awaiting your arrival. Good, let's go then. The man nodded, and the violet-robed mage followed his footsteps. A small whisper escaped Charles's lips. Finish them. A faint shadow behind him nodded in confirmation. I ignored the rest of the conversation. After all, there were more important things to take care of. Like the invasion on my doorstep. Only a few minutes had passed since the explosion, and both my monsters and those outside were confused. But confusion didn't mean inaction. 4 of the already hurt orcs were in a bad position earlier, squashed under the bodies of their companions, slowly choking to death. That was until the explosion threw them down into a weird hole. Their grunts echoed out in the cavernous holes. Sensing the dead flesh of their companions disappeared, my doing by the way, they stood up, their primitive weapons readied. A second or two passed in silence until their ears started to hear again, and a strange sound repeated in the background. Clang, 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 clang. It was getting closer. The monsters huddled together, their breaths growing quicker and quicker. With widened eyes they stared at the closest corridor, none of them wanting to advance. And then the decapitator found them. My thirsty walls were once again splashed with warm blood. The group had fallen to the conservatory was a bit luckier, the only enemy here being my plants. That is, until one of them stepped on the fiery dandelion, one of my more acidic creations. It spewed corrosive materials all around, just like it was designed to do, killing and hurting the intruders in the process. My Libras and Jailer Jonathan didn't even have a chance to shine. I was sure no matter how many enemies would come for my creations would still stand tall. It was a certainty that I was going to regret in the coming hours. According to my cameras, most of these monsters had indeed crowded towards the newly opened entrances. Some moved to the old one and bashed down the hatch covering it. They were currently fighting it out with the sentients. The rest were funneled towards the second floor. Yes, my monsters fought valiantly. Libras and even Failsmith mounting a resistance every few centimeters, backing out when another enemy fell. But the space was retreated was limited. In the end, they gave their lives trying to bleed the enemy dry. My traps and plants also worked wonders, taking many with them. The spears, the pitfalls, the acidic plants, the strangle roots. The decapitator managed to turn the walls bright red before it was overwhelmed. In the process of said battle, it also collapsed my tunnels, not without the fresh surge of mana being reinforcing them. This in turn divided the enemy forces cleanly, forcing those in the east to focus on the humans, while the rest attacked me. My monsters still respawned, since the system didn't recognize the invaders as sentients, but the appearing creations were immediately getting torn to shreds. But not Jailer Jonathan, or Decapitator, or Enhanced Biobrain Golem. These three fought their own battles, especially the last one, a hulking brute stuck in a room where the bleeding would trigger the bloodlust effect. He was now a showstopper for the steady trickle of the enemies trying to conquer my lower level. But none of them managed to return. All of my creations, undead and whatnot, were on high alert, and the once calm central pond room now looked more like a surface of the moon than a jungle, with all of the craters covering every 3 centimeters of space. Every few minutes a large explosion echoed, adding to the grunts and screams of the invaders. I managed to time the Libra exploders' production in such a way they appeared when another group beat the floor boss. The resulting explosions pretty much always decimated the incoming monsters, feeding me enough energy to keep producing more exploders, and more Libras. The Rattlings had their hands full too, fighting the guerrilla war in the tunnels, murdering any goblins, kobolds, or other smaller monsters inside, getting murdered in return. It was a brutal campaign, with claw against claw and teeth against teeth. A war of attrition. Not once or twice I saw a rat perish while still strangling the neck of its enemy. The unreasonable violence continued as my creations threw themselves senselessly at the advancing horde. They weren't stopping because neither was I. At least the giants, trolls, ogres, and other large creatures seemed bored senseless only after a few days of observing the slaughter. since they were far too big to fit into corridors and join in on the fun. They just up and left without a word, leaving a clutch of shamans and veritable sea of monsters behind, still waiting to ravage my dungeon. The situation stabilized. For me at least, the days passed and the humans were on their last legs, constantly charging monsters, a lack of sleep and tension of their families waiting just behind the corner combined into a veritable powder keg. It was only a question of time until somebody broke. And a few more days passed again. The sentients were screaming at each other, and I hoped to taste all of the goodness hidden in my halls, especially the mages. But the fricking elves arrived as reinforcements. Couldn't catch a break, could I? End of chapter. Chapter 48. Uno. The long years arrived unseen, their stealthy troops making short work of the sentries that the fallen tribe's horde had dispatched. Well, calling them random assortment of lesser races anything like gods was a stretch in itself, but then again they fulfilled the role with surprisingly high effectiveness. I was sure that the rangers were wearing the green and brown armor that would get discovered soon, considering that the horde didn't lack monsters with superior sense of smell. Yet somehow they advanced unhindered, long, straight daggers reaping life after life. Even so, they dropped when stragglers were taken care of. The rest of the enemy's sleeping much too big troops were quietly overwhelmed. Only a few hundred were left on the surface now, about the same amount surging angrily through the various parts of my dungeon. My first and second floors contained small, wary groups of monsters wandering through and occasionally battling against my creations. A surprisingly large number of them were concentrated near the place where the humans holed up. The Colosseum and the newly dug-out tunnels turned out to be a bloody battlefield. I was wondering what those elves were up to. These 200 soldiers were getting on my nerves like Damocles' sword. My few remaining cameras were stretching off the half-biological stems to survey the surface. It didn't take long to notice the commotion. A few richly clothed elves were vehemently arguing with an important-looking girl. Somehow, they managed to do it in a relative silence, too. Color me impressed. The said girl had long, blonde hair curled into locks and a pair of piercing neon green eyes, which seemed to glow in the dark. Her small body was clad in a greenish-blue leather armor. I ascertained that it was a magic item of some kind, mostly after seeing the seam shift lazily after a few seconds. She wore a leather helmet too, complete with boots and sturdy pants, while the wooden one rested on a belt loop with a thin waist. Currently, she was listening to the other people's arguments with a bored expression on her pretty face. I could barely hear them, but it didn't matter anyway. They were using a foreign language and I was no privy to. I guess my constant contact with the humans had me at a disadvantage when it came to other races. Just behind the bored blonde, a large, more like gigantic man was standing quietly, his blue eyes surveying the surroundings with a calm sense of caution. He was clad in leather armor and strengthened with metal plates, but different from the people surrounding him. But that wasn't the source of incongruity he emanated. Only after a few minutes, I understood what was so strange about him. All the people around had sharp, knife-like ears, but not the giant. That was it. A human amongst the elves, a rarity, and, considering the disdainful glances thrown in his direction every few moments, the other people weren't entirely pleased with his presence. He ignored them splendidly, though, not wasting any attention on the surrounding soldiers. Instead, he focused more on the outside. Not much was visible under his armor, but what flesh peeked out through it looked tough, like the man himself, a veteran. His weapons of choice were a sword and shield combo, right now both hidden in their sheaths. The quarrel between the girl and the other elves didn't look like it would end soon, so I shifted my attention downstairs to observe the human underground encampment. A constant battle raged in the small and now damp corridor, which was technically no longer part of my domain. The monsters were mostly getting slaughtered, orcs or lizardmen no match for the few powerful human fighters remaining. From time to time, a bolt of magic or a blast of otherworldly energy cut off the constant stream of challengers. making sure that the defenders had at least some respite. A small, slender man in a red bandana was currently fighting. His butcher's cleaver carved chunks out of meat out of the attackers. He laughed loudly, staring at the incoming enemies. His clothes were splattered with red blood, both fresh and old, and a few cuts marred his muscular body. A desire for blood and battle emanated from him was a clear deterrent to the advancing monsters, but also to his own troops. A few of the remaining human soldiers and the adventurers were so already pale, their dead eyes and slow movements a clear sight of exhaustion. Most of all, the fear they felt, both because the boisterously laughing man and the advancing horde was clearly visible on their faces. "Come, come, frickers, join us in this bloody dance," the man shouted in the red bandana, his sudden voice startling both the allies and the enemies. "My blade wasn't fed enough today. Neither was I. Come on, quench my thirst," he continued. The monsters stopped in their tracks, trying to decide who would be courageous one to lead the advance. For a few seconds, a silence ruled over the small piece of hull, until a roar resounded from the back. Something big was starting to make its way towards the defenders, monstrous howling in elation, until they understood that for their new champion to appear, their own lives were forfeited. The tunnel wasn't big enough to let it safely plow through, after all. With a sound of exertion, one of the orcs was pushed forward, tumbling towards in the process. And another one after that. Each of them met their end at the humans' blades and spears. Their howl turned resentful, forced to die without a purpose. And then it appeared. A large, obese monster that once resembled an orc, but not anymore. It had lost its tusks. The green color that it was born with had faded long ago. What remained was a mass of flesh, vibrating with each step it took. Pale flesh, with visible folds of fat underneath, was snapping against each other. Plop, plop, plop. Unlike the champion's sickly-looking skin, its hands had turned into fearsome weapons, enlarged, serrated claws made from bone. The beast raised its arm, letting the claws touch the walls, and amidst the screeching noise, a long scar appeared on the rock. "Damn, our weapons weren't even able to scratch that," mumbled one of the adventurers in a fearful daze. The orc champion roared once again, sending the remaining monsters into a frenzy, as they rushed forward, practically throwing themselves at the defenders' blades. Yet, as the case when attacking without considering one's safety, their reckless charge managed to kill and maim 3 out of the 8 warriors in the room. The screams of the wounded filled the air as the bandana-wearing man commanded, "Get the wounded to the healers, this bitch is mine." A wild smile appeared on his face. "Come here, fatty. I wonder how you'd taste." As if to emphasize his words, he licked the butcher's cleaver, comfortable resting it on his right hand. The large amount of blood ended up in his mouth, enraging the opponents and pushing the human forces for a quick retreat. "Guildmaster Lewis, you really lost it, huh?" One of the escaping soldiers scowled, only to get reprimanded by his companion. "Shut it! Do you want to end up with his unnecessary casualty, like that one guy before?" Hearing the adventurer's words, the distracted warrior only shook his head in silence. Right, that was the bandana guy's name. Lewis. The new guildmaster of the Adventurers Guild. I knew I saw the man somewhere before. But then again, his figure was much more gallant at that time, not to mention he wasn't fighting like a maniac. Not my business, though. With the butcher's cleaver in one hand and a sting-like dagger in the other, he waited for the fat orc champion to fully emerge from the tunnel. As useless but gentlemanly move, that was what I thought at first. Then, as soon as the pale monstrosity breathed in to roar its challenge, he struck. The long, thin dagger easily delved into the monster's stomach, only to get stuck. Lewis retreated immediately, leaving the weapon stuck inside. This time it was the monster who laughed, snapping its flabby stomach and jumping forward with a speed unbecoming its mass. The human guildmaster wasn't taken by surprise, though. He deftly avoided the incoming claws, retreating a few meters to the back. "Throw me some daggers, people," he ordered, not looking back. "We'll be having some skewers tonight." The men complied, swords, daggers, and even spears thrown in an impromptu ring. Lewis laughed loudly, picking up the rather heavy-looking sword. He swung it around with one hand, swishing noises showing just how much strength he contained in his thin arms. Pale Orc roared in anger, not understanding the contents of the speech, but clear on the mocking tone. It charged forward once again, trying to kill the annoying buzzing fly. This time, however, Lewis wasn't content just at avoidance. He silhouetted, flashed, and disappeared, only to emerge behind the monster. A little appetizer for now, he laughed, chopping down on the flabby flesh. The new sword cut deep beside the beast's back, but in the end it didn't manage to sever it. Lewis grunted, forcing it even deeper, only to get swatted by a large arm. He flew away, bouncing back off from the chamber's walls. Then, for a long moment, he just lay there, while the Pale Orc roared in delight, blood starting to pool nearby, while the soldiers and adventurers under his command looked at each other before nodding deeply. He might be a son of a bitch, and a dastardly fracker, but he saved my life more times than I could remember. Brothers, with me, save the Guildmaster. Their screams were cut short when, with a grunt, Lewis lifted up his battered body. Don't kill me off just yet, boys. The grin escaped his lips. He licked the bloodied arm. Salty, now let's pay you back, fatty. He roared back with his words and defiance, and the soldiers responded in kind. Enough! A voice shattered the celebration. It was Charles, the noble leading the survivors. His red hair and eyes were alight with magic. Fireball. A large ball of flame flew forward, staggering the beast and scorching its flesh. Firebomb! Magical energies landed on the ground, soaking the stone. The fat orc roared in confusion. Fireball. Another flame soared through the air and exploded. This time, the enemy was prepared, shielding its scalded face with the pale arms. The attack still did some damage, but it didn't manage to stop it from moving. With another roar, the champion charged. Charles mumbled under his nose, seemingly ignoring the advancing enemy. Hey, look out! Lewis couldn't stop himself from screaming. It seemed, however, that the red-haired noble planned for this attack. As soon as the fat orc stepped on the stone a few meters away, the magic that had soaked it suddenly activated. For a split second, I could see the complicated magical circle appearing, and then an explosion pretty much cut and maimed the monster's legs, like an anti-infantry mine would. The orc roared in pain, slowly dragging its body towards the chanting mage, still stubbornly clinging to life. Greater fireball. He finished the chant when a large ball of flames appeared in his palms. A moment later, he threw an unhesitatingly, betraying a solemn grace of a person already used to decimating his foes. The orc was swallowed by the fire and turned into ashes without any ceremony. Like a tense battle that Lewis had to go through was just a lie. Then, in one swift motion, he turned back to the tunnel, where the next wave of monsters was already coming. Seeing the decimation, they staggered through, casting fearful glances on a powerful human fire mage. This was a mistake on their part. Charles mumbled under his nose again, quickly unleashing another magic. Wall of flames. Instantly, the tunnel was filled with fire, burning and killing any monsters inside. Unlike what I expected, it didn't create a single tile horizontal blockade. No. Instead, it started at the entrance of the tunnel and ended just before the defensive chamber. It was perpendicular. Ingenious. I never grow bored of these magics of yours, Charles, mumbled Lewis through his bloodied mouth, and I believe, Guildmaster Charles, that we had a deal. The red-haired noble answered in a cold tone, making his companions twitch uncomfortably for a moment. Hey, I didn't know that they'll send a champion this early. But they sent it, and according to our defensive strategies, I was to be informed of such an intrusion. The mage continued. May I remind you that while you were playing games, our men were dying? His voice trembled for a moment. May I remind you? Charles! The Guildmaster interrupted, lifting his hands up in a gesture of surrender. Charles! His words snapped the maid's attention to himself. I was not playing games. You and Master Vincent are the aces in our sleeves, but, look at you. He pointed towards the mage. It was only now that I noticed the noble's eyes had not yet fully red, but also bloodied from the lack of sleep. He was swaying on his feet, trying to keep straight and proper. "Look at you, friend. You need rest," Lewis continued in a quiet tone. "How much did you sleep through these 2 weeks? A few hours a day, maybe?" It was enough, the red-haired mage stubbornly refused. "I leveled up, so—" "No. Believe me, I know that leveling up fills up you with power, but it doesn't replace your need for sleep." The slim man grabbed the mage by the shoulders. "Go sleep. We'll manage. For Bella's sake, please." The guildmaster bowed and remained in that posture. The soldiers and the benches behind them heard the whole conversation, and their voices echoed Lewis's statement. "Please, sir, we'll manage. For the Gaynard Kingdom. Leave us and rest, sire." "Sir." Seeing the whole room bowing, Joel sighed loudly, while combing his red hair with an impatient hand. Yes, I heard you all. I'll go," he frowned. "But remember to call me when something powerful comes through. We cannot fail." He stumbled, only to get caught by a few adventurers. "The wall will burn for half an hour. Prepare accordingly," Charles added while slowly returning to his quarters. After he left, the silence ruled the defender chamber. It was Lewis who broke it. "Get the wounded out of here, ask the tenders for water and food, and change the shift." A voice appeared from behind. "Molan!" Lewis laughed loudly, seeing the once proper captain of the Gaynard Kingdom, Molan W.R.E, casually walking through the tunnel flanked by his subordinates. The prim and proper soldier was wearing a damaged uniform, yet somehow still stay clean in this hellhole. "Hello, Lewis." The man nodded seriously. "Before laughing loudly, you should take care of yourself before reprimanding our fire-wielding maniac." "What are you talking about?" frowned the guildmaster. "It was our turn to stand guard 2 hours ago." "It's not a competition." "Yes, but remember that these shifts were assigned this way to let the common soldier rest." He squinted. "I'm not talking about monsters like you." "What are you? You nearly took on a champion by yourself, didn't you?" The man grinned. "Yep." A similar grin appeared in Lewis's face. "Then, how's leveling?" A quiet question. "Goes to level 10. The even quieter answer. "Good." Molan clapped his back. Then, out loudly, "We're taking over." Then he added even louder, "Let's show these folks how the army does things, boys." "Yes, sir." A choir of voices answered. "Interesting." On the surface, it would seem that the obstacles of the path forced the sentients to come together and fight for the collective survival, to abandon preoccupations and fears while presenting a united front to the enemy. It was only on the surface, though. While the soldiers fight, the civilian population was forced to live in squalor and manage on pitiful rations. Food was, after all, reserved for those who defended them. No matter how sheep-like the common man was, he would turn rabbit once he was forced into a corner. Through my rats, I felt the masses shift, women cradling their children and asking their husbands for salvation, cold and cruel beatings administered to those who dared to speak out. I heard the whispers in the dark. I heard the rumors of food and weapons are missing. I had seen new tunnels being built, away from the defensive line, deeper into the wall, and then up, always up. And then their tireless escape had been blocked by me. More escape tunnels breaching the surface meant more entrances, something that I wasn't too keen on. To prevent that, I focused on growing roots of my silver trees. Yes, they were cut down to build the defensive outpost, but nobody bothered pulling out the stumps. Any mana that I managed to gather wasn't immediately funneled back into my defenses, and it was sent over to the root network. The plants grew sturdier, their above-ground parts changing to accommodate the evolution. The silver iron barks were now once called large trees with dangerous leaves. Some of them remained, too far from the former outpost to be used by the workers. They grew even now, left to their own devices. But many were now destroyed, their flesh used as sentient constructions. Over these days I had forced them to grow, stay alive. Their network expanded and intertwined, covering the whole ground with steel-like growths, just below the surface. No more drilling holes into my dungeon, no more people simply digging to reach me. There were two unexpected changes to the plant itself, though. One was a pretty minor. The root network accepted my other creations, giving space and sometimes even sustenance to grow them. However, this treatment didn't cover plants like wheat or rice, or whatever food was normally grown in the Gaynard Kingdom. This meant that the experiments with the rattling agriculture had to be moved forward in time. The second one rather baffled me. The remains of the silvine bark turned into natural traps. The stumps simply dissolved into a flat circular plate directly connected to the roots. Innocuous, right? Except that when something or someone stepped on that large number of spikes would appear, skewering the victim and thus allowing the plant to feed. I decided to call it a spike sundew, due to how it reminded me of a certain insect-eating plant. Coppergrass often grew nearby, covering the likewise easy-to-spot flat surface on the plant. After a few successful hunts, the bodies of the fallen were an additional bait. So I left the spike sundew alone, happy with another way to thin out the attacking horde. Well, here I was going off on a tangent again. The point was, these humans were going to hurt me like that again. The manor on the first floor was still thin, but the additional entrances were healing, slowly. An invisible membrane was forming over them, retaining most of the spent energy. I guessed that something similar must have happened when I explosively made my surface entrance, but now I had an opportunity to observe how it all worked. In slow motion, too. That said, I was still far away from creating a dome, or a magical equivalent of a barrier, maybe, and thus conquering the surface. But a dungeon core can dream, right? A few more hours had passed and the elves had come to an agreement. Their forces had started to move towards the human encampment. The proud elf girl said a few harsh words, but lifted her hands in a gesture of surrender. At least that was universal. A moment later she left with a human in tow. Once the decision was undertaken, the silent warriors attacked without warning. Most of the monsters died in their sleep, rarely getting up and screaming before they were cut down anyway. This, of course, woke the remaining of the invasion force, but seeing the elves eliminating their comrades in a professional fashion was too much. The monsters broke away and ran. The Long-Ears did not pursue. What happened afterwards was a bloody and tiring work of clearing out the eastern tunnel and contacting the humans. Once the survivors heard the sounds of battle near, morale had returned and their attacking force was immediately formed. Hours later, the last monster was dead, and the warriors and mages were wading through a mixture of invaders' flesh and blood, reaching up to their ankles. In these circumstances, a meeting between Gaynard Kingdom forces and the Elven expedition came to be. The elves were represented by the girl, as shadowed by the large man from earlier, while the humans had Charles Blueflame flanked by Captain Mullen DeRee, Guildmaster Lewis, and Master Vincent on their side. My name is Malalia Luna, the third princess of the royal family. She bowed graciously, her foreign accent nearly impossible to discern. I have come to your aid according to the Northern Kingdom's pact. We welcome your aid, O fair princess. Charles, even tired as he was, remained a true blue-blooded noble. Charles Blueflame of the noble house Blueflame greets you. The mage's bow was much more pronounced and servile than hers. Good. A cold smile appeared on her face. Then, let's start. Our arrival here wasn't a random coincidence after all. We know what this place is. She wildly waved a hand while scrunching her pretty face in disgust. Harbors of a forgotten dungeon. Our aim is simple. To destroy it. To smash its core, after all. No technology of the Forbidden Era may remain, according to the Lunar Kingdom's laws. I refuse to let that happen, answered Charles simply, while observing the incredulous expression on the princess's face. We're on Gaynard Kingdom's territory, and your laws don't mean anything here, princess. He once again bowed deeply, a trace of contempt hidden under the mask of gallantry. The temperature froze. End of chapter. Chapter 49. Uno. The blonde princess's reaction was interesting to watch. She just looked at Charles incredulously, her mouth opening and closing a few times, like a fish out of water. Different emotions swirled in her eyes: surprise, anger, humiliation, and then a simple resignation. Too bad. I was getting ready to see how she differed from the other people trying to reach my core. With a sigh, Manalia raised her hands in the air, eliciting surprised grunts from the humans. They all entered a defensive stance, 2 high-ranking owls behind the princess also trying to move between both parties in a rushed panic. Somebody here was treated as untrustworthy, huh? All she did, however, was turn her head in the direction where the people stood and spout a long series of words in Elvish. After speaking her piece, she simply turned and stomped away, taking her bodyguards along. The rest of the room froze in consternation, the humans much more weirded out than the owls. Thankfully, I wasn't the only one that didn't understand a word that she said. "Master Vincent," whispered Charles, while trying to look calm and collected. "I don't know Elvish. Could you please translate what the princess said?" "Yes, I should be able to. It's quite quick, but I believe she spoke something along the lines of, 'Since you were the ones who wanted to save the humans first, then deal with this. I have better things to do than quarrel with these rude people, so clean up your mess, idiots," he whispered back with a quiet chuckle. Charles just stood there for a second, digesting the new information. "She isn't that very different from our own princess, then," he responded with a tired sigh, but quickly adopted a noble demeanor, noticing that the 2 well-dressed owls were approaching the human delegation. "I am afraid that our meeting started on the wrong foot," smiled the larger and more muscular of the 2. "My name is Acric Oakbound, and I am one of the commanders for this mission." The scars on his face gave a dark impression, which was quickly dispersed by his cheerful demeanor. He walked forward with his hands outstretched, and Charles immediately greeted him back. "Charles Blue Flame of the House Blue Flame," he repeated, while bowing and pointing towards the companions. "Behind me you can see Master Vincent, our magic advisor." The old man in the weird cap cheerfully waved back. "Guildmaster Lewis, chief of the local adventurers." The local butcher looked disinterestedly at the half-elves and nodded deeply nonetheless. "And the commander of our military forces, Captain Malone W.R.E. The man in question saluted, his eyes never leaving the approaching party and hand on the handle of his sword. "Nice to meet you," Acric bowed softly, while half turning towards the last member of his own delegation. "This guy is my co-commander and our resident mage, Ian Slickett." Behind him, a smaller, more delicate elf was simply observing, his full and childish face somehow more serious than those of his companion. Nonetheless, he bowed deeply when he was introduced, speaking in a soft tone. "Hello, humans. I hope that we can reach a compromise." "And you have to breach the topic this way in," mumbled Acric, surprisingly in a human language. Then he shook his head. "Let's negotiate." He then turned his attention back to Charles's group. "I'm not sure if there's a need for any negotiation," said the red-haired noble as he stared down at the half-elves. "We simply can't reach a compromise. You want to destroy the dungeon core, and we want to preserve it. We don't have anything to talk about." His head shook back in a calculated denial. "And since these are our lands, we don't intend to budge." But a small smile appeared on his face. Yes, I know it all. But for now, we need to understand if this place is truly a forgotten dungeon." Charles's raised brow prompted Acric to continue. "You see, we don't really have any proof that this place produces Magic Tech Empire-era weapons." He stopped for a moment, and I noticed that his companion, Ian, stabbed a finger in his back, likely trying to deliver a message of "Don't tell them that." The bigger man, however, simply ignored him and continued. "Because of that, I would ask to present the electric weapon that our scouts found on the first floor, as a show of good intentions." Acric smiled wildly, staring at the human delegation. His intentions were clear. "We know there is a weapon like that, so show it to us or we'll check it ourselves," was the message. Charles nodded in consent. "Master Vincent, could you please do so? If I remember correctly, the weapons were in your custody for research purposes." He half-turned, asking the old mage for help. "Yes, of course, Acolyte. Please bring me the lightning weapon sample." A moment later, a violet-robed mage arrived with a wooden box. He carefully moved towards Vincent and deposited it in his hands. "Thank you." The old mage smiled, his wrinkled face more focused on the weapon than anyone present. Master Vincent, Charles coughed. Yes, here we go. Please handle it with care. Our samples are limited at the moment. He smiled again, while smoothly handling the weapon to the elves. I'll check it out. It was Ian who intercepted Agric's hands. His eyes were glittering with a curiosity I, more often than not, saw in Master Vincent's eyes. He put the box on the ground, unlatching the hatches and opening it impatiently. A small gasp escaped his lips as he stared at my creation, touching it delicately like he was afraid to break it. Then, with a renewed vigor, he picked it up and he imitated a wide strike. Then, with the press of a button, electricity buzzed on the surface of the weapon, mesmerizing the surrounding crowd. Then, with a sigh, he turned it off and spoke. It's a forgotten dungeon for sure. He shook his head. The level of quality is unmistakable. I'm doubly sure, because this item uses magical engineering principles, not simply enhancements. What's the difference? Asked Charles curiously. I was interested too, not knowing that there was another way of doing this stuff. The half-elven mage stopped his work for a moment, thinking about the correct words to explain. It's hard to say because nowadays the art of enchantment is already lost, but there is a rule of thumb to be recognizing these things. When using enchantments in array, you may call it a magic circle. It is carved onto the weapon or similar artifact to grant it a special effect. Then the user spends his mana to activate it and a set effect, feeding it energy. This thing, he pointed towards my cackling mace. It doesn't need an activation process. It has energy reserves inside, making it perfectly functional in the hands of a non-magical person. So what? You say that like it's a bad thing. That only means that even soldiers who are not gifted with magic can use it. More versatility is always nice. He smiled widely. Ian wasn't having that. His hard stare never leaving my creation. So what? Are you for real? What you have here is a powerful weapon that doesn't need a mage to operate it. Think about the consequences, human. Hey, elf, don't get carried away. Captain Jerry stepped forward, not having a random demi-human offending his companion. Surprisingly, Charles grabbed him before things escalated. What you think is a demerit for the Lunar Kingdom counts as an advantage for a Gainer Kingdom. Greater good, always, in any sacrifice. The noble bit back, citing something or somebody with solemn voice, his eyes hardening too. I guess the half-owls hiding out in their forests don't know the real meaning of desperation just yet. A toothy but cruel smile appeared on his face. No matter how hard the war gets, our Lunar Kingdom will never change or forsake our tenants. We are not like the lesser races. Ian answered with a heated gaze, pride seeping from his very being, but stopped speaking when Agric put his hand on his shoulder. There is no need for hostility, please. The bigger elf stepped forward. What matters is that we confirm that this place is indeed a forgotten dungeon. So, it means that the dungeon core had consumed some of the earlier era technology and is now reproducing it, right? Lewis asked, gathering a bunch of derogatory gazes. What? I'm a common adventurer before. None of this magical bullcrap mattered. Yes, you are correct. Master Vincent decided to get into the teaching mode. What we call a forgotten dungeon is a dungeon core with somehow devoured a complicated magical technology of an earlier era and now is starting to reproduce it. It is worth to mention, however, that there are many levels to how the dungeon can interact with this new knowledge. You mean it can gain experience and grow? No, nothing so simple. For example, this weapon. It could be that there was an armory containing such lightning maces. Unlikely, but possible. It would be a recreation level, not really that dangerous, despite what our long-eared friends say. He smiled warmly in the elves' general direction. Another possibility would be that the dungeon has acquired a similar item, like lightning bows that we discovered before in other sites. This would mean that the idea behind the weapon was remodeled to fit a different criteria. Because of that, it would be called a remodel level. More dangerous, but also more profitable, depending on the point of view. Once again, his gaze wandered towards the demi-humans present in the room. And you think this place is of the remodeling type? Lewis made sure. Yes. Are there other types? There is one. Transform level. the ability to freely use any acquired technology and implement it into existing designs. The elves visibly twitched. Lunar Kingdom had a bad case of such a dungeon in its infancy, thus the current policies. "Could you tell me about it?" Lewis asked, for once not bored with the conversation, his eyes glittering like those of a small child. "I could, but it's a story for another time. I am afraid that we have more important things to worry about." The kindly, grandfather-like smile appeared on Master Vincent's wrinkled face. One could nearly forget that he was a powerful mage commanding forces beyond human comprehension. "Good," sighed the visibly bored Charles. "Anyway, it doesn't matter what your intentions are. This is the Gaynor Kingdom soil and Forgotten Dungeon is ours. I am sorry, but that may not be true." Hagrid smiled apologetically. "What do you mean? I would assume that you know about the monster wave that assaulted the northern border." "Of course. It was the reason we were seeking shelter in these caverns." Charles nodded warily. "The great defensive line of the city bastions was broken. Cogent Road and the First have fallen." Adric had said solemnly, looking at the human's reaction. A flash of surprise appeared in their eyes when Charles started laughing loudly. "They've fallen, you say?" he said, mad light brightening his irises. "Yes? And what do you want us to do? We could offer you shelter and a place to live in exchange for the dungeon rights." The elf stuttered his last words, seeing the human noble coming closer. He grabbed his clothes and lifted up the struggling long ear. "Frack off." The earlier toothy grin wasn't an illusion. "The Gaynor Kingdom is fighting a losing battle against its enemies, and you dare come here offering me to abandon it. Talk about double standards, you piece of crap. Noble elves, my rear." Charles threw the bigger man back, the co-commander landing heavily on the ground and rolling away. He grunted and started to lift his body up. "And you?" His face turned towards the other elf. Ian, already preparing to cast a spell. "Get your companion out of here before my patience is completely runs out." "You?" The mage was seething with rage, but straightened himself out after seeing the flame appearing suddenly in the human's hand. "I wasn't asking." With a huff, the smaller elf dragged his companion out of the tunnel, while glaring at the humans with hatred. "Was that wise, sir?" asked Captain W.R.E. "It was the only answer I could have given. Unless you want to serve as a Lunar Kingdom watchdog, just like this poor sod following their princess." Charles shook his head, losing his earlier monstrous look. His figure turned weak and desolate. "I see. Captain, please get our sentries topside and start rebuilding the outpost. These trees should regrow completely in a week or two, so use the local material," he ordered in a tired voice. "Yes, sir. Also, keep the elves out of the dungeon, especially the princess." "Why?" It was Lewis this time who was asking the question. "I have a bad feeling about her. She smells similar to Princess Agnes." He noticed a weird stare from Lewis. "What? Smells like? Sir, what have you been doing with your life?" The black-haired man smiled dumbly while licking his lips. He was immediately smacked on his head. "Ow! What was that for?" "Do you need to ask?" Charles answered exhaustedly while returning back to his human campsite. Yet thanks to Lewis's question, the atmosphere turned somewhat lighter. The humans retreated, same with the elves, the former re-establishing their outpost on the surface, slowly rebuilding. The latter formed a cordon around the place, living off the land, which was impressive, considering that most of the surface was either wasteland or under the thrall of my metallic domain. And I was killing off the last waves of the invaders. According to the rattlings, most of the kobolds, goblins, and other monsters were already exterminated. A few last bastions of oppression were found and summarily razed. The guerrilla warfare turned most of the rat tunnels into death traps and taught the survivors valuable lessons in the art of battle. My rats were harder, more ruthless, and more opportunistic when fighting. More importantly, when killing the last of the mutated kobolds, the rats' vanguard discovered something interesting. The cowardly kobolds were defending with a frenzy earlier unseen, throwing their scaled bodies against the rattling's enhanced claws in a futile attempt to stop them. The advancing units were getting the worst of it. Nearly half the rats were wounded or dead. In the end, we managed to conquer the nest, only to find what they were defending. Eggs. A clutch of eggs. There were 36 of them to be exact. Unlike the ones we fought, with damaged limbs, weird growths, and blind eyes, they were looking surprisingly healthy. Still, their loyalty after birth was not guaranteed, so I decided to use my ultimate move, which was to have it transported near my mechanical core gem and then convert it into a dungeon life form. It would be a waste to learn that I had such an ability and then simply forget about it, right? Under my command, both Libras and Rattlings did the best moving the egg after egg into the underwater chamber, where they were carefully put on the ground, like an offering before a pagan god. This was also the place where I moved Guardian, who until now was bored, staring at the enclosed walls. Because of these new additions, he once again grew lively. "Can I name them, my lord?" he asked pleadingly over the mental link. Yes, you can do whatever you want with them. Pet them, eat them, train them, whatever. Once they're born, my secondary core will convert them and I'll get the blueprints, so you can do what you want with them then. Thank you. He was somehow able to transmit a feeling of contention across. I should ask the smith golem to make some armor and weapons for them. He mumbled more to himself than to me. Do as you wish. I closed up the link before more of the inane ideas bled through. I turned my attention to the lost invaders instead. A group of them were moving into the underground lake room. Should I say another group? These creatures simply didn't learn. My rattlings already understood the glass progenitor's attacks, anything that produced vibrations, so be it sound or movement, so their scoutings wore special boots over their claws. The invading orcs and lizardmen didn't use any precautionary measures. They simply charged forward, no preparation, scouting, or anything. Because of that, I was a witness to another bloody battle scene. 2 of the lizardmen decided to go for a swim. Who knows why? Their sleek yet deformed forms were cleanly cut through with the dark water. It took only a few seconds for the progenitor to recognize that the food was on the table. It snatched the lizards in one fell swoop, dragging them down with an enormous maw, turning the water red after the first chomp. The rest of the warriors, about 20 or so, understood that there was something dangerous in the lake, and bolted towards the nearest door. Sadly, instead of retreating, they chose to run towards a room at the far end of the artificial coast. 3 more warriors were picked up by the hungry progenitor when the first of the runners arrived at the closed door. He jerked the handle back, only to get skewered by a suddenly appearing spear. The rest screamed something, curses maybe, and hesitated for long enough to have more of their numbers snatched. Roaring loudly, they disappeared under the water, saturating it with even more red color. This forced the rest of the band to advance. And advance they did. Right into the spikes, water cutters, and, as a final touch, a spear pit. Only one orc managed to stagger back, his body cut and battered, hyperventilating sobs, and in the large irises a clear sign of shock. Too bad that the glass progenitor was still hungry. Seeing that these invaders were dealt with, I moved over to the points of resistance, only to notice that my creatures were having a field day with the attackers. One of those was in the middle of the metallic jungle room, just south of my central pond. It was a training place both for my Air Force rattlings, using their tame dragonflies, and the Iron Flame rats. Their cooperation was perfect. The flying rats were harassing the enemy, while the small, self-sufficient teams of temple warriors and common Iron Flames were cutting down enemy numbers with a combination of fireballs and good old melee. One by one. The jungle was full of screams, the otherwise silvery trees singed with flames or blood. They would get reclaimed soon, returning the area to its earlier look. Some battles were also raging northeast of the main room, but those were mostly confined in small exchanges between Libras and enemies. The Libra captains thrown into the mix, not to mention random Libra exploders or electro-touched, appeared in the battle of attrition. One that I was winning. which forced me to consider another question. What should I do with the central pond room? Right now, it looked more like a moonscape than a forest full of vitality. I guess that was how the unrestricted usage of exploding leverage changed the environment. Something in me wanted to leave it how it was, to spread fear and awe in the would-be conquerors. On the other hand, the trees and small hills made spotting my fiery surprises that much harder. Decisions. Not to mention that the third floor was still being dug out. I needed a place for my experiments, but also to turn my ideas into reality. And, of course, start both my rattling enhancement plan and freck you anima plan. Non-iron molded revenant, Gaynard Kingdom capital, Shield Star. The journey towards the country's capital should take about a month for the prepared wanderer, yet such speed was normal only if considering that they needed to sleep, defend against dangerous beasts, as well as to eat and crap. These constraints were no longer binding of the undead that was Tina turned into. She ran forward with a single-minded conviction, a burning feeling of revenge. Her figure disappearing from shadow to shadow during the days, and with the night being full of long jumps. Doing so, none didn't care about being seen, birthing rumors about a dark maiden traversing the shadows while clad in metallic armor. Thanks to that, she arrived in Shield Star in about 2 weeks since her birth. The imposing walls and gates meant nothing for one wandering through the night. She teleported to the battlements in a span of seconds, surprising one of the patrolling guards. Before the man could confirm whether what he saw was an illusion or not, she disappeared from sight. Happy, her instructor would say. In another life, in another time. Was he alive too? She didn't care. With a steady gait, she disappeared in the alley, her half-naked body drawing glances, but nothing more. She looked like an adventurer, and the look of her armor suggested a magical nature. There weren't many people stupid enough to mingle with such a dangerous person. Not on the streets, anyway. A pickpocket who followed her into the alley looked around in confusion. She was gone. With a shrug, the young thief turned to his everyday tasks. Non decided to first check on the place where her sisters lived. While the core had been accommodating and the goddess sympathetic, she wasn't able to trust them before confirming her siblings' whereabouts with her own eyes. She found that their place in the orphanage had been taken, 2 small boys sleeping in the bed where her family had once laid. It took all of her willpower not to strangle the life out of them. Instead, she appeared in the nuns' quarters to interrogate the woman she'd once loved like a mother, the one who took care of all the things happening in this place. Mother Superior, she was called. Nobody bothered with her real name. Non-shadowy figure appeared from the darkness, scaring the older nun. She opened up her mouth to scream, only to have it covered with the gold-armored fingers. "Shut up," she groaned the figure. Only when she nodded in compliance did the dangerous hand relent. Please don't kill me. I'm nobody. I don't know who you're searching for, but it's simply an orphanage, please." The old woman bowed deeply, her body trembling, her voice no more than a whisper. "Joanna, Berea, but where?" asked the armored figure, and the nun suddenly raised her head. "Tina, is that you, child? What happened?" she asked, trembling still. "Answer." A simple word spewed like a curse. But you should be already know. I sent letters. I told the overseer." Her voice cracked, a realization dawning on her face. "Oh, please, don't kill me, please. I had nothing to do with it. Answer." "They died a few years ago. The overseer deemed them unfit for duty and stopped their rations. They starved to death. I'm sorry." A few tears escaped the nun's tightly closed eyes. The undead nun was also trembling. A wave of cold anger was currently coursing through her veins. She glanced down at the kneeling woman. "Overseer Henning?" she asked coldly. Yes." Nun nodded. She remembered there was many things, many memories she had forgotten. But in the end, only the revenge mattered. With a single arm, she lifted a struggling woman up into the air. Please," she begged, struggling to get free. The other children would die without me." She whispered the last of her words, clearly losing her breath. "Have mercy!" "No." With a swift movement, she separated the woman's head from her neck. This enchanted dagger was no joke. The body fell to the ground with a dull thud, and then the blood started to seep into the carpet, dyeing it red. None only stared at the scene of the carnage. All was silent. Then she curled up a fist. Unknowingly, her mouth stretched into a wide, inhuman smile. Henning. A moment later, the shadows fluttered, and she was gone. Her revenge was not yet complete. End of chapter. And that concludes the video. I hope that you enjoyed. If you wish to support the channel, there are numerous ways to do so below. I'll see you all in the next video, and I hope that you all have a good one. Until then, cheers.